Hey everyone, I am Magical Hacker, and this is episode number 19 of the Eminence Podcast, the non-CEDH Commander podcast where I help you in the command zone with your deck building skills and on the battlefield with your deck piloting skills. This podcast is brought to you by Zethus Soon and the rest of my patrons at patreon.com/magicalhacker. Today we'll be discussing the topic chosen by Zethus Soon: how can you build a tribal deck without becoming the threat? I think this is a fascinating topic because for a long time, I didn't even think about this. I'm actually not big of a tribal player. I never have been, except for when I very, very first started. I built a shapeshifter tribal deck, but typically I'm not a tribal deck builder. The closest thing I did to anything tribal based in a long time is what used to be my Sultai Sea Monsters deck, which had Kraken, Octopus, Leviathan, and Serpents. And so it was built around a lot of the cards that care about specifically those four creature types. And it was a fun deck. I really enjoyed it, but I ended up taking it apart to make room for my treasure deck. And honestly, tribal, strategies are not really my cup of tea. I'm not really that hugely, invested and interested in playing creatures because they're so fragile. So personally, my favorite creature-based deck is my equipment deck, which really isn't creature-based because it's really equipment-based. And then my second favorite is all indestructible creatures. And so I can tell you I'm not a big creature guy. I've got a token deck that's like making token copies of creatures, but even then it's, so I don't have a creature deck that really I can say, hey, this is the creature deck that I play. That said, I do think I have a little bit of knowledge about what we can do because I have an infect deck. And so there have been these decks that I've built where there is some overlap with what a tribal deck would want to do, and I think I can bring to the table a lot of expertise that could hopefully help you out and make you able to build a tribal deck without becoming the threat. All right, number one step, you've got to pick the right commander and the right color identity. I think a lot of times we look at a commander and we say, oh my gosh, this would be so cool for a vampire tribal deck. I got to build it, and then we kind of get so distracted by how awesome the commander is. And we build a deck where we quickly become a threat very early on. And then we might wonder oh my gosh, what did I do? What happened? Where did I go wrong? Well, we went wrong when we picked the commander. We didn't pick the right commander, or we didn't pick the right color identity, right? Let's say we're trying to build, what's a good example of this? Let's say I'm trying to build human tribal, right? Well, humans are available in all sorts of colors. So do I go 5 color or do I go something less? And so sometimes having fewer colors is actually a smarter idea because your commander choice is what gets people, it's like their first introduction to what your deck is doing. If your deck is being really scary, then having a non-scary commander can help reduce some of the threat level that your deck is portraying. If your commander is super scary, then you might appear to be a threat even before you've even done anything. So picking the right commander, picking the right color identity, I think both of those are very, very important. Here's a great example I actually remembered just now. So dragons, available in all 5 colors. People tend to pick the Ur-Dragon, 5-color commander with Eminence, which is the ability that after which this show is named. So, they might say, well, obviously I'm going to play the Ur-Dragon. If I'm playing Dragon Tribal, why would I pick anything else? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The Eminence ability is, if this is in my command zone or on the battlefield, all my other dragons are costing 1 less mana. So now my 4-drop dragon, I don't have to do anything. It's just automatically going to cost me 3 mana. That 7-drop automatically is going to cost only 6 mana. And so it seems like it's the perfect commander for that. You're taking this expensive creature type and you're making it cheaper. What could possibly be a bad idea about that? Well, even when you don't have the Ur-Dragon out, people are already going to be afraid of you, so you might not live long enough to actually get to use the value generated from the Ur-Dragon in order to win the game. Whereas, let's say you were playing a different dragon commander. Let's say you were playing Dragon Lord, not Dragon Lord, what is the other card that I'm thinking of? Kolaghan the Storm's Fury, that's what it is. Kolaghan the Storm's Fury, it's got a bunch of abilities. The one important one here, it says I think it says whenever a dragon you control attacks, each other creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn, which seems like not a very good ability. But if you have it and 4 other dragons attacking, then that means that each of your other creatures, or each of your creatures are going to get, +4 +4/+0. Is that right? Hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, +4/+0. And if that's over 5 creatures, that's 20 extra power on the board in your attacking creatures. So it's a very powerful commander, but it's only black and red. It's not all 5 colors. So I think it's important to pick the right commander and the right color identity. Sometimes better is not better. Sometimes better is actually worse, and worse is actually better when it comes to the commander and the color identity. So ultimately, 2 things I think are important to remember about this step is, hey, it's okay to pick a commander that cares about that chosen tribe, as long as it's not famously powerful, if it's not super popular for that tribe in particular. And I think the Ur-Dragon is a fantastic example of that. On the other hand, though, it's okay to pick a commander that doesn't care about that chosen tribe, as long as it accomplishes some other role for that deck. And I'll talk about the 2 other roles that I think are important for a tribal deck that's interested in not becoming the threat. First off, I think you need to plan. And what you need to plan is a slow early game. So you want your early game, you want to, on purpose, be very weak looking at the table, which sounds very counterintuitive for Commander in general, but I think you'll see where it can really reward you, especially for tribal decks, which are very heavily creature-based, sometimes heavy on small creatures. Only a handful of tribes actually have a lot of big creatures. Most tribes have a bunch of small members, right? And they're just like 1/1s or 3/3s or something small, and you're not going to be doing a whole lot of work with them, but you've got to play them down eventually. And it might seem like, okay, well, it's a 2-drop. I might as well play it on turn 2, right? And so I think instead of going for what seems to be the easiest or the most straightforward, you've got to plan it out. You got to plan out, what am I going to do in my early game that's going to make me look slower than everybody else? That might mean that you're just setting up by ramping, setting up by drawing cards. But what it doesn't mean is it doesn't mean that you don't have blockers or you don't have pillow fort. That is very important when you're planning out your slow early game. Token makers, especially, I think, fulfill this role really well because let's say you're playing Snake Tribal, you could be playing a card like Snake Pit, which every time an opponent casts a blue or black spell, you create a snake token, a 1/1 snake token. Or you might be playing something like, let's say you're playing Fairy Tribal. You might be playing Bitter Blossom. It's a 2-mana enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life. You create a 1/1 Fairy Rogue, I think, with flying. So you can create tokens. Those tokens can make it so that your opponents don't want to attack you. Not because the tokens will kill their creatures, although you can always play like Death Touch equipment and then equip those equipment to your tokens and make it really hard to attack you. And you really punish your opponents for going for that attack. But even then, it's not really that's the role. The whole goal is to make it so your opponents are looking at the 3 options that they'll have, the 3 opponents, and you want them to look at you and say, "Yeah, I'm not going to accomplish much. I'm not going to attack that person." That's what you want to try to prevent. You don't want to punish them for attacking you, although that's also a nice strategy. You can play cards like No Mercy. Whenever a creature deals damage to you, destroy that creature. It may say Source, actually. I don't know. Whatever it does, it definitely will kill creatures that deal combat damage to you. So you could play stuff like that for punishing your opponents who attack you, but you don't necessarily need to do that. You could also be fine with just making it so that your opponents look at your board and say, I don't feel like I'm going to gain enough value from this attack. So for that reason, I'm not going to attack you. Token makers, I think, are a really, really cool way to both do exactly that, make it kind of you're gumming up the board, preventing people from attacking you cleanly. And at the same time, you can start to build some members of that tribe already on the board so that you can then go into your tribal game plan more easily. The second thing that I think is important to remember when we're talking here about planning a slow early game, what it means is that you're happy to be setting up until after the first few board wipes happen. So, if you play out that Snake Pit, it's an enchantment. If you play out that Bitter Blossom, it's also an enchantment. There's artifacts, there's planeswalkers, there are other non-creature permanents that will be making tokens or preventing opponents from wanting to attack you. Those cards don't care about board wipes, and I think that's where you want to focus your attention. What can I do to build up my board presence in a way that survives board wipes? Because board wipes will happen. People do tend to play creatures, and they do tend to play board wipes to get around those creatures, so kind of wait for those first few board wipes to happen before you start jamming out your commander and start playing some of the most important cards in your hand. It's not really the smartest way to play. So wait for those first few board wipes, and then after that, then we go into step number 2, which is where you plan a fast late game, which seems kind of counterintuitive or kind of a contradiction. If it's the late game, then it's not fast. How can you plan a fast late game? But what I mean here is to go from 0 miles per hour, maybe starting on turn 6 or turn 7, up to 60, 100 miles per hour on turn 8 or turn 9. Really focus on getting a fast acceleration, not necessarily a fast top speed. Because if you're interested in a fast top speed, you're going to start from 0 miles per hour on turn 1, and you're going to try to go every turn, get faster and faster and faster. But doing that just makes people want to use their resources to stop you. Kind of like in Mario Kart, where if at the very beginning of the race, you're in the lead, you're in first or second place, opponents will be using their shells on you. They'll be using the lightning bolt or the blue shells. Of course, I'm not an expert in Mario Kart, so I have no idea what these things are actually called. But my point is, those things preferentially hurt whoever is likely to win based on information from just the first portion of the game. That doesn't necessarily mean that person's going to win. They're just the most likely to win based on the current standings of where everybody's at. If you can avoid being in first place at the early game, then that typically means people are not going to be spending their resources on you, which as a result typically means that you'll have an easier chance to actually win the game in the late game, where everybody got kind of hurt. They've used their resources on each other. Blue shells are gone. Lightning bolts are gone. And so at the very end, you just use your mushrooms and get fast into the first place, and then you pass the finish line and you win the game. Right? So that's how, that's a good strategy for Mario Kart, and I think that applies here to Commander as well. If you can just wait till right before you can win and then use your resources to accelerate yourself to the win, you'll find yourself having a lot less pushback. It's not going to be as much of an uphill battle at that point. Okay, so plan a fast late game. There are also 2 things I want to talk about here, and these things are related sort of to specific colors. So the first thing is, it's important to find ways to chain multiple creatures into each other per turn. So, for example, there are a lot of green cards that when you cast a creature or whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you get to draw a card. So if you've already ramped a bunch and you've got your 7 cards in hand, if you're playing a lot of really small mana value creatures, like 1-drops and 2-drops, but you've got 12 mana, it might be tough to just dump out your hand, because then you won't have anything to play if a board wipe happens. So it's important to have ways to, while you're playing out your hand and you're getting all these creatures onto the board, it's an important thing to have ways to refill your hand by doing that, because that's the advantage to being so explosive in the late game. You can do it in a way that you can take advantage of, like I said, with those green cards, that let you draw cards off of that tribe or off of creatures in general. The second thing about planning a fast late game that I want to talk about is you really want to find ways to substantially increase your damage output with your creatures as well, especially if your creatures are all really small, but really this applies to every tribe. So what am I talking about here? Green has overruns. Of course, those are really good for tribal decks. White can give all your creatures double strike. There's a couple of cards that can do that. There's Akroma's, Akroma's something. There's a 4-drop instant, Akroma's something. And it's not Akroma's Vengeance. I know what that one is. It's Akroma's something, and it can give all your creatures flying and double strike and protection and blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of things on there. You've also got True Conviction, which is a 6-drop enchantment that gives all your creatures double strike and lifelink, which is absolutely fantastic. Not just for outputting damage, more damage. You get to gain some life too. You get to survive any crackbacks that may happen as a result for you starting to try to win the game. And then red, I think, is the king of this particular category, because red has haste enabling, it has extra combats, it has ways to double or even triple the amount of damage you're dealing. So red is really, really good at that. But every color seems to have just a little bit, maybe blue, not quite so much. But I think there's a lot of things you can do to help increase your damage output, because you might not need to kill all 3 opponents from 40 life to 0 life each. You might not be the only one responsible to dealing all 120 of that damage, but regardless of how much damage your opponents have dealt to each other, you still want to very quickly reduce opponents' life totals to 0. You want to try to minimize the amount of time that your creatures are just sitting on the board waiting for their next turn, because that's where board wipes can really take you out of the game. And that's the whole reason why you wouldn't want to be a threat in the first place. So that's the kind of the three main important, I think, goals for a tribal deck. You've got to first pick the right commander, and that includes the right color identity. You got to plan a slow early game, and then you got to plan a fast late game. This kind of applies to all decks, but I think if you don't do this in a tribal deck, you get especially punished because of how the way Commander works. Creatures are typically one of the most important card types. People typically plan their decks around the idea that people are probably going to have a lot of creatures at some point, so I better have board wipes or pillow fort to protect myself. So with all that in mind, I think there's certainly a lot of things that you want to keep in mind. There's 3 other traps that I'm seeing. So those are the 3 steps. There's 3 traps that I think it's really good to be mindful of and then try to avoid. So the first trap, and probably the most common trap, something that I used to say for a long time, but I don't say this anymore, and it's this idea of it's better for me to use up my mana every turn. And that's definitely not the case. A lot of times we think of, well, I have 4 mana, I'm not using it. If I use 4 mana and play a 4-drop, then that means I'm doing something better than if I don't play that 4-drop that I have in my hand. The problem is there's a difference there, not just about if you have that 4-drop on the board or not. It also matters, do I have that 4-drop in my hand or not? So if somebody plays a board wipe right after you played out that 4-drop creature, you actually made the wrong move, because now you don't have that card in your hand anymore. So there's a risk. Everything that you play is both upside and downside. That yes, the upside is I got something out, but the downside is I lost something from my hand. I went down a card in my hand. If we only were to look at cards in the hand, that would be card disadvantage. Cards on the battlefield, yes, it's advantage, but we have to keep that in mind that there's 2 elements here, hand and battlefield card advantage. So that's the first trap. Don't feel like you have to use up your mana every turn, because a lot of times it's better to not use up that mana. All right, what's the second trap? 1, I'm not playing board wipes because I'm a creature deck. Well, of course you're a creature deck, you're playing a tribal deck, but just because of that doesn't mean that you can't be playing board wipes. In fact, it's probably a bad idea to not be playing board wipes, because not playing board wipes in your deck is the equivalent of saying, I feel guaranteed that I will always have the biggest board presence at all points during the game, every game. And honestly, that's very unrealistic. I can't think of a deck that could possibly guarantee that, where they would say, yeah, I know I don't need board wipes, because there's always going to be a situation where someone just happened to line their stuff up a little bit better. Now they have a big board state, right? Or maybe they're not playing the right way. They're just literally throwing out all their creatures out there. You want to be able to punish them with a board wipe, even if you're playing a creature deck. It's still important to have board wipes. It's like saying, well, I'm not a deck that cares about drawing cards, so I'm not playing any card draw. No, card draw has a specific purpose. It's to help you do more stuff. Board wipes have a specific purpose too. It's allow you to do more stuff when people have more creatures than you. And it's not an if people have more creatures than you, because guaranteed they will have more creatures than you. There will always come a time, at least in some number of games, where you won't have the most creatures on board. So just because you're playing tribal decks doesn't mean you can't play board wipes. I think it's still important to play at least 4 board wipes in your tribal decks. You can pick a board wipe that actually synergizes with your tribal deck. Let's say you're playing Might Tribal. Go for the White Sun's Twilight, right? That can destroy all the creatures and then create a bunch of Might tokens. That's a solid board wipe to include in a deck like that. So you can maybe find board wipes that care about your tribe. That's always a possibility as well. But regardless, definitely play board wipes. You don't want to avoid that just because you're playing a tribal deck. And then last thing is, I gotta play this card in my deck. Why? Because it's a Lord for my chosen tribe. This is a very big trap people fall into all the time, where they're playing Merfolk, and so they say, I've got to play Lord of Atlantis. It's a 2-drop creature, gives all my Merfolk +1/+1. But think about it. What is that card doing? How is that card helping you? Because it's got to help you somehow, otherwise you don't play it, right? Is it helping me do a fast late game? Kind of, but not that effectively. Maybe it's your best option, and if that's your best option, then go for it. But you've got to consider each card as not just is this card good enough to go into the deck, but is it better than what the next option would be? Because we're including cards based on what we think would be worth it in that slot. And that does mean, especially now where there's so many cards, that means that good cards don't have a spot in the deck because there's so many other cards that are even better than those good ones. So that's the third slot. Don't feel like you've got to play the card in the deck because it cares about that tribe. Sometimes caring about the tribe isn't enough. Sometimes you want to have members of that tribe that are individually good on their own, and then other cards that care about the tribes, but not necessarily every single card that cares about that tribe. Like, for example, if there was a card out there that said, all merfolk gained menace, right? Menace may not be what your deck needs. It may not actually be helping you that much, so you might not want to play that card, even if it's a merfolk. All merfolk get Island Walk, that also similarly might not necessarily be worth it in the deck. Island Walk +1/+1, okay, maybe then we're talking, but it depends on what other options you have. Do you also have red in the deck? Do you also have green in the deck? Is it mono blue? You know, what actually is happening in the deck? Don't just say, does it care about the tribe? Okay, I'm automatically playing it. Because I think if you do that, you might end up finding yourself not having enough room for the cards you actually do want to include in the deck. So, ultimately, I think those are my three tips for what to do and my 3 tips for what not to do. So to summarize, 3 things to do. Pick the right color identity, pick the right commander. That's step 1. Step number 2, plan a slow early game. Step number 3, plan a fast late game. Then the 3 things to avoid the 3 traps. 1, don't feel like you have to use your mana up every turn. 2, don't avoid playing board ups just because you're playing a creature deck. And then 3, don't just play cards just because they care about the tribes. Actually look at what they're doing for the deck. But that's my take. If you disagree or if you have any comments, please leave me a comment at youtube.com/magicalhackermtg or a tweet at twitter.com/magical__hacker. Speaking of which, let's take a look at some of the comments that you all left for me. Starting off with DMany13, who commented on episode 12, titled, Can I Build a Commander Deck That Is Both Good in Multiplayer and 1v1? DMany13 said, building a deck that's good for multiplayer and 1v1 isn't that hard. It's more about what hand you keep. You have to think differently with your mulligans. Example, all my decks run 5 to 7 spot removal and somewhere between 2 to 4 wraths. In 1v1, you want to keep at least 1 interaction spell and something to put on the board by turn 2 or 3, and you don't look at ramp as much, while in multiplayer, you will more value a ramp card in your hand to having the removal and something to play on turn 2 or 3 that could block or give you some sort of advantage. I've played against Mr. Tribal Kai. He's a very good deck builder, and most of his decks are for 1v1. That's what most of his videos are. I also really enjoy watching Tribal Kai, D-Many, and so I've looked at the way that he builds his decks, and yeah, you're right, he does build a lot of his decks with 1v1 in mind. However, I do think there's some differences into how you build a deck for one format versus the other. You did definitely talk about how maybe in 1v1 you don't look to be doing as much ramp. You might be more focused on interacting with your opponent, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm not a big 1v1 player, so I don't know a whole lot of what's the most effective strategy there, but I do know that the most effective strategy in multiplayer, from what I've been seeing, would definitely not work in 1v1. And so my answer there about how those two styles of commander, they're both putting a focus or rewarding different things in your decks. I think that's what we really want to keep in mind. If you're playing multiplayer, just like we talked about in this episode, plan a slow early game, plan a fast late game. Whereas if you're playing 1v1, you want to plan a fast early game. There's no punishment for that. You're going to do that, and you're going to have the most success winning games if that's what you do. Maybe in CEDH, that's also the case there. You want to plan a fast early game. But in non-CEDH Commander, I don't think that's the case, especially from my experiences. I see that get punished more than I see it get rewarded. So thank you for the comment, D-Many. I think we do agree on a lot of stuff here. More so than it kind of sounds like from the comment, but definitely appreciate your insight there. All right, next comment is from Voralek, commenting on episode 13. How do you pare down a collection that has gotten too big? Voralek says, the pile technique is good. I use it a lot. I think you can also do by staples because it forces you to think about what format you play, how you play, etc. I think that's a good point too. So in that episode, I talked about putting piles of your cards. If you're not interested in organizing cards to have it organized so you can build your decks online and then go find the cards, if instead you want to build decks based on your collection, which I don't personally do, but if that's what you wanted, you could then take your whole collection and separate it by piles of strategy. What strategy does this card fit in? And you make a pile for that. And one of the piles that I mentioned was staples. And so Vorelek here is talking about, think about staples in terms of also what format you're playing. This is a Commander staple. This is a Modern staple. This is a Pioneer staple, or whatever it may be. And that's what they're referring to here about. It forces you to think about what format you play and how you play. Because maybe Vorelek looks at one particular card and says, oh yeah, this Bitter Blossom is a staple in Commander. And I might say, it's not really a staple. Whereas I look at, wow, Curse of Exhaustion, that's a staple in Commander. And Vorelek says, nah, I don't think so. Right? And so everybody can define that staple a little bit differently. And that can be helpful to help you learn about what how you build and what you think about cards as well. Let's do one more comment here and then we'll close it out. Savino Balducci on episode 14, is Mycosynth Lattice plus Titania's Song and similar combos good or bad in Commander? Savino Balducci says, if you take as example such low numbers like the 4 you mentioned, it's clear that your initial 12 isn't good enough. But I think that like 8-ish card draw or ramp is easily enough if you see 12 card initially, while if you want to see them both in the current Mulligan system, you got to run something like 14, and that's a pretty big ask that people don't want to please in order to play their favorite or flashy card. That's what I am referring to. So Savino here is referring to something I mentioned in the wrap-up segment that I was doing in that episode, where we were talking about the Mulligan idea that I had, talking about how there's potentially a way to get around all the problems that we have with our current Mulligan system. And I mentioned some things there. I would just definitely refer Savino back to the math that I showed there, where with your current system, 14 definitely helps you see it more often. But if you include 14 in whatever category, you actually get to see more in your hand with the idea that I presented in my Mulligan episode. I wonder which episode was that, because that must have been earlier than 14, earlier than 12, since we've already talked about that as well. It was episode 10, Should the Mulligan Rules of Magic Be Changed? So definitely listen to that episode if you haven't heard it before. And then to Savino, I would say, to me, my opinion is based on the math that if you play too low of a category of cards, you're more punished in the Mulligan system that I presented compared to the current Mulligan system, because in the current Mulligan system, you can get rid of cards and get new cards, which you can't do in the new one that I presented. And that is a very, very big deal. So if you're not playing enough of a particular category that you should be, which is something that Savino here is talking about, not necessarily something that I'm espousing, but if that's what you really want to kind of encourage, I think the best way to do that is mathematically which one is going to be more punishing to not playing enough of that card. And mathematically, the Mulligan system that I'm proposing is the one that ends up having more punishment to running fewer of a particular card. That wraps up the time we have today for answering questions. If you want to pick the topic for an episode of the Eminence Podcast, check out patreon.com/magicalhacker. In fact, the topic for the next episode will be, are hunted horror style cards good or bad in Commander? And I'm calling this the Prisoner's Dilemma episode. And so if you want to listen to that episode, make sure to subscribe on YouTube or follow on Spotify to get notified of that episode when it comes out. Thank you again to Zethus. Thank you to all of my patrons, and thank you for listening. Stay awesome, everybody.